It's now just over 220 years since the Battle of Trafalgar on the 21st of October 1805, a date which marked a huge naval victory for the Royal Navy over a combined French and Spanish fleet, but which came at the cost of the legendary Lord Horatio Nelson on board his flagship HMS Victory. Before describing the battle and Nelson's innovative tactics, which led to victory, I'll outline some key aspects which influenced the fighting ability of the Royal Navy at the time. I won't delve into the complexities of Nelson's earlier life and marital arrangements. These are far too complex for a simple sailor, but I would like to acknowledge in particular Commodore Kim Pitt, whose presentation I've drawn on extensively, the Royal Museum in Greenwich, and a BBC animated map of the battle. The ships of the early 19th century were the technological marvels of the day. They were large, expensive, and complex systems that were necessary for major powers, but were a drain on natural resources and, of course, the public purse. In order for a dozen new ships involved major industrial and logistic complexities. Oak and pine timbers from more than 1,000 first-grade trees, flex and hemp for 26 miles of rope, thousands of handmade blocks, more than 800 guns, and of course, all the skilled craftsmen to put them together. Warships of this period were magnificent machines. They were classified or rated according to the number of cannons that they carried. A first-rate ship carried over 100 long guns and had 3 decks. 32-pounder guns on the lower decks, 18-pounders on the next deck, and then 12-pounders on the weather deck. The ships also carried upper deck carronades that were not actually counted in the rating system. It was possible for a 38-gun frigate, for example, to carry 44 powerful guns. I'll firstly mention some environmental issues that were unique to the period and relevant to the battle itself. The first I've called social. Were the recruitment processes truly abhorrent? Did they really suffer appalling health and welfare issues? What about the brutality of Navy life in the 18th and 19th centuries? That sort of stuff. Recruiting was always a challenge. There could be as many as 17 different nationalities in British ships. It seems they always had trouble recruiting enough men to man them, and this was especially so in wartime. At the beginning of the Napoleonic War, Parliament increased the size of the British Navy to 45,000. The population of Britain at the time was around 9 million. In 1794, that was increased to 85,000, and in 1799 to 120,000. If French and Spanish fleets ran short of sailors, their custom was to put soldiers to sea to fill the gaps. However, in Britain, the Navy only sought out replacements who were specialist seafarers and used 3 means: volunteers, the impress system, and from 1795, the Quota Acts. Volunteers were in fact, sailors were volunteers, but there was always a shortfall. The impress service came into being because there was a forced recruitment process. The organisation at the ports charged with obtaining seamen to fill the empty berths was known as the impress service. In law, the impress service was limited to seizing men who were seamen, though this seems to have been given a fairly liberal interpretation. The crews of merchant ships were often targeted, and fishing villages were fair game too. But it's true that many poor souls with little, if any, seafaring skills were pressed into service simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Then in 1795, William Pitt introduced 2 Quota Acts, which laid down that each county in Britain had to provide a quota of men for service at sea, with numbers depending on its population and number of seaports. London had to produce 5,704 men, whilst Yorkshire, the largest county, in area had to provide 1,081. The Navy was preoccupied with health and welfare. They would not match today's standards, of course, but were certainly ahead of prevailing social standards. The men were critical to the success of campaigns, and for self-serving reasons, the Navy tried to look after them. Food was important, as was morale, so access to alcohol, medical treatment, the employment of women, etc., and all issues related to the care and attention of the crew were matters for special attention. Food was critical. Supplying the fleets was an immense undertaking and was controlled by the Victualling Board. Victory carried supplies for up to 6 months at sea, though Nelson's accounts show he was always on the lookout for fresh supplies. Nelson knew well the importance of a healthy diet to the maintenance of good health, and particularly the need for fresh fruit to keep scurvy at bay in his ships. Sailors were well fed and far better than any of their contemporaries ashore. They ate meat 4 days a week, salt beef or pork, with double amounts on Saturday. Ship's biscuits provided carbs, even when stale, and on other days of the week the ration was a half pint of oatmeal, half pint of peas, and equal amounts of cheese, butter, and sugar. Nutritionalists nowadays reckon the naval diet in the Georgian period gave the average sailor around 5,000 calories a day, which was needed for young men doing a huge amount of heavy lifting. Meal times were one of the highlights of the day. Naval discipline in Nelson's time is often viewed as an unbending code of starting, flogging, and hanging. The discipline was harsh but fair, but to take punishment out of the context of the times is to miss the comparison between life on land and life at sea during the Georgian period. At sea, the rules that the men obeyed were known as the Articles of War. A man could only be hanged for mutiny, treason, or desertion. Were women at sea in ships? Admiralty regulations forbade the carrying of women. However, as with many regulations, this was often ignored. At sea, the women carried the powder from magazines to the guns and tended to the wounded. We know there were some women in Victory's crew. Rules in harbour were a little more relaxed. Drunkenness was a big problem in the Navy, contributing to a large percentage of the floggings ordered. The men were entitled to a gallon of beer per day. This was healthier than drinking water, especially if it had come from ashore. It was small beer, not very alcoholic, but they also received a half-pint rum ration per day. Along with tobacco, the beer and rum were used to alleviate some of the tedium of life at sea. It doesn't take a great leap of imagination to see that the amount of alcohol available to the men must have been a contributory factor to the number of men dying of individual accidents. Here's a comparison of fatalities in the Royal Navy, albeit in 1810. You can see that 50% of deaths were caused by disease, the second largest amount, 31%, by individual accident. A study of casualty lists of any war up to 1900 reveals that disease killed more sailors than any other cause. Profit was a huge incentive for every crew. Winning by surrender rather than sinking was both technically prudent, as wooden ships were particularly difficult to sink, and profitable. The Admiralty paid prize money to crews that took ships in combat. For example, the prize money from the capture of the Spanish frigates Thetis and Santa Brigada in October 1799 was £652,000. This was split up among the crews of the 4 British frigates, with each captain being awarded £40,730 and the seamen each receiving a bit over £182, or the equivalent of 10 years' pay. So the motivation for British seamen was not just the lash. They could, and did, earn small fortunes in battle. They were driven to succeed. They spent more time at sea than their foes. They became excellent seafarers and ferocious combatants, and their seamanship and gunnery skills were second to none. The second environmental factor I've called technology. The three navies at Trafalgar, Spanish, French, and British, were battle hardened, operationally experienced, and managed and administered by long established sophisticated bureaucracies. None of them were lacking in skills, and it was not by any means a given that any one of them would prevail in battle. History suggests there were good days and bad days for each. But it must be said that the British had the technological and tactical edge. By the outbreak of the French Revolutionary Wars in 1793, a series of technical innovations first introduced during the American War of Independence had combined to give the British fleet a distinct superiority over the ships of the French and Spanish navies. And here are a few. For example, the Bentinck pump was a device that could pump huge volumes of water from any space in a ship and ensure survival after being holed in a battle. It allowed the discharge of more than 1 ton of water per minute and was far in advance of anything held by the French or the Spanish. The practical benefit was huge, but also the assurance that their ships had a higher chance of survival because of these pumps was a major morale booster for crews too. British ships were armed with two main weapons, the long cannons and the carronade. The standard 32-pounder fired a shot just over 6 inches in diameter. With a full charge of 10 pounds 11 ounces of powder, it can make an extreme range of 2,000 yards. At such close ranges, the power of penetration of round shot was impressive. At 300 yards range, a 32-pounder firing grape shot could penetrate 5 inches of fir planking and 4 inches of oak. At 30 yards, an 18-pound shot would penetrate 4 oak planks 32.5 inches thick, that's just under a metre, hurling a shower of splinters up to 30 yards. Combat separation ranges in battle were short. A pistol shot of 30 yards was more common, a musket shot about 200 yards, and gunshot about 1,000 yards. The carronade was a short barrel gun developed by Carron Company of Scottish Ironworks in 1778. Because of irregularities in the size of cannonballs and the difficulty of boring out gun barrels, there was usually a considerable gap between the ball and the bore, often as much as a quarter of an inch, with a consequent loss of efficiency. This gap was known as the windage. The Carron Company their design reduced the windage considerably, enabling the ball to be fired with less powder and hence a smaller and lighter gun. The carronade was half the weight of an equivalent long gun, but could throw a heavy ball over a limited distance. The light weight of the carronade meant that the guns could be added to the forecastle and quarterdeck of frigates and ships of the line, increasing their firepower without affecting the ship's sailing qualities. It became known as the Smasher and gave ships armed with carronades a great advantage at short range. The flintlock firing mechanisms were used in lieu of matches and a fuse, which enabled a higher rate of fire and greater accuracy. The gun captain could choose the exact moment of firing. Prior to this, the Royal Navy had experimented with goose quills filled with powder to get an almost instantaneous burn time. Ship's rigging was vital. Simple improvements in standard fittings, attention to quality control in manufacture, and more efficient rigging systems, their blocks and tackles, meant that British ships manoeuvred better, required fewer crew to operate, and left more men available to fight rather than sail the ship in battle. After many trials, copper sheathing was found to be a practical means of protecting the hulls of ships from marine growth and fouling. Copper sheathing delayed the growth of weeds on the hull, which improved the sailing performance of ships that had long been out of dock. This had significant strategic as well as tactical implications. Prior to this, the British, who kept their ships at sea for longer periods, had mostly found the clean French ships were faster, could therefore avoid battle if they wished. Introduction of copper sheathing meant that ships that had spent months on blockade were not necessarily at an immediate speed disadvantage compared to enemy ships coming freshly out of port. There was tremendous difficulty in communicating at sea. Written communication was almost impossible in a moving fleet, while hailing was extremely difficult above the noise of wind and weather. So admirals were forced to rely on a prearranged set of signal flags hoisted aboard the admiral's flagship. The British had introduced a secret set of signal codes in 1800, developed by Captain Sir Home Popham, using existing signal flags flown in groups of 3 to distinguish the meaning of orders issued from the yardarms. These were especially useful for efficient command and control of a fleet. So, in 1805, the British had the technological edge. The third environmental aspect I call warfighting, which plays into the expectations and tactics of the British fleet at Trafalgar. At the beginning of the 19th century, the British were operationally experienced and tactically expert after centuries of combat at sea. They had had many successes to reflect upon, whereas the French were somewhat diminished in naval capacity because revolutionary fervour had placed less value on maritime matters. The Revolution's purge of senior and experienced naval officers, many were aristocrats who were executed, left their leadership lacking, and importantly, Napoleon himself placed less store in the value of his navy than did the British. Conversely, in Britain, Prime Minister Pitt and Britain itself had a culture of reliance upon and confidence in their navy. Naval tactics were primarily determined by the sailing and fighting qualities of the ships. 2 factors in particular constrained what a sailing admiral could order his fleet to do. Ships of the time carried their guns in 2 large batteries, one on each broadside, with only a few cannon mounted to fire directly ahead or astern, and warships could not sail directly into the wind. The prevailing tactical orthodoxy at the time involved maneuvering to approach the enemy fleet in a single line of battle, and then engaging broadside in parallel lines. One reason for the development of the line of battle system was to facilitate command and control. If all the ships were in line, signalling in battle became possible. The line also allowed either side to disengage by breaking away in formation. If the attacker chose to continue, their line would be broken as well. This often led to inconclusive battles or allowed the losing side to minimize its losses. Also, the line ensured each ship sailed bow to stern with her sister ships, which made the maximum use of firepower without getting in each other's way. But the hulls were immensely powerful on the sides and very weak at the bow and stern. The sides of the ships were built with strong timbers, whereas the stern in particular was fragile, with a flimsy structure around the large windows of the officers' cabins. In fact, the bows and sterns of the ships were vulnerable to raking fire. So the importance of sailing in a tight line to protect these soft areas was de rigueur, as the French would say if they could speak English. Let's think a bit more about raking. If the attacking ship could fire at another ship by firing at either the bow or stern, this caused tremendous damage. A single shot would fly down the length of the internal fighting decks, while the target ship could not return fire with its broadsides. Moreover, as ships passed astern of their opponents, they could progressively wreak havoc upon their internal decks as their main guns each came to bear on the enemy as they passed. The weather gauge. Most ships could sail not much closer than 70 degrees off the wind. This limited the manoeuvrability of a fleet during battles at close quarters. So, holding the weather gauge, that is, being upwind of one's opponent, conferred considerable tactical advantages. The admiral holding the weather gauge held the tactical initiative, able to accept battle by bearing down on his opponent or to refuse it by remaining upwind. However, for the fleet with the lee gauge, there were real disadvantages. The fleet with the lee gauge could certainly avoid battle by withdrawing to leeward, but could not force action. Even retreating downwind could be difficult once two fleets were at close quarters, because the ships risked being raked as they turned away. A second disadvantage of the leeward gauge was that in anything more than a light wind, a sailing ship that's passing close hauled or beating will heel to leeward under the pressure of the wind on its sails. Thus, the ships of a fleet on the leeward gauge heel away from their opponents, exposing part of their bottoms to shot. If a ship is penetrated in an area of the hull that's normally under water, she's then in danger of taking on water or of even sinking when on the other tack, and this is known as hull between wind and water. And finally, smoke from the gunfire of the ships to windward would blow down on the fleet on the leeward gauge. In the heat of battle, it was usual to be blinded by smoke, so even visual signalling was troublesome. So it was common for battles to involve days of manoeuvring as one admiral strove to take the weather gauge from his opponent in order to force him to action. During the 18th century, French governments developed the strategic doctrine of focusing on the mission rather than fighting for command of the sea. The French government was often reluctant to take tactical risks to achieve its strategic objectives. The navy was hampered by the timidity of its orders, and French fleets and squadrons typically sought to avoid battle rather than risk a contest with the British force. And this strategy had important tactical ramifications. French ships tended to fire at the rigging of their opponents to disable them, reducing their speed and allowing the French ships to escape and continue with their mission. French ships typically fired their broadsides on the upward roll of the ship, disabling their opponent's rigging, but doing little damage to the enemy ships or their crews. This was compounded by the French tendency to fight from the leeward gauge, causing the guns to point high as the ships heeled with the wind. British and Dutch ships, by contrast, tended to use the opposite tack of firing on the downward roll into the enemy hulls, causing a storm of flying splinters that killed and maimed the enemy gun crews. This difference in tactics goes some way to explaining the difference in casualty figures between British and French crews, with French fleets tending to suffer not only more casualties, but also a higher proportion of killed rather than wounded. When the conflict arose between the British and the French in the 18th century, battles between equal or approximately equal forces became largely inconclusive. Historians note that when sea battles were fought in line of battle, casualties were always high, but they seldom resulted in decisive victory for either side unless boarding and hand-to-hand combat were involved. And by the end of the 18th century, this unsatisfactory feature of the accepted method of fighting battles at sea had begun to be obvious even to naval officers. It was clear to many that the only way to produce decisive results was to concentrate the attack on part of the enemy's line, preferably the rear, since the centre would have to turn to its support. Sir John Clarke of Eldon began developing a series of speculations and calculations, which he initially published in pamphlets, distributing them among naval officers, and published in book form as an essay on naval tactics in 1790, 1797, and 1804. The hypothesis which governed all of Clarke's work was that as the British Navy was superior in gunnery and seamanship to their enemy, it was in their interest to produce a melee. He noted that outside 1,000 yards, most gunfire was inaccurate, and that inside 1,000 yards, the angle of fire from more than one ship in the line could not be trained to target the same enemy ship. He advanced various ingenious suggestions for concentrating superior forces on parts of the enemy line, by preference on the rear, since the centre must lose time in turning to its support. So by the outbreak of the French Revolutionary Wars in 1793, technical innovations and the disorganisation of the French Navy, wrought by the Revolution, had combined to give British ships a distinct superiority over the ships of the French and Spanish navies. Notwithstanding recruiting challenges, Britain had a far larger ocean trade than any of her principal enemies, and a much bigger reserve of professional seamen from which to man her warships. Throughout the 18th century, the French and particularly the Spanish Navy suffered from serious manning difficulties and were often forced to complete the ship's crews with soldiers or landsmen. British ships not only had a higher proportion of seamen in the first place, but the long months at sea on blockade or convoy escort gave British captains plenty of opportunities to train their crews. British gun crews seem to have achieved a much higher rate of fire than French or Spanish gun crews, contributing to the much higher casualties suffered by ships from those fleets. The better seamanship, faster gunnery, and higher morale of British crews was a decisive advantage that could not be compensated for by any amount of bravery on the part of their opponents. So with all those factors in mind, let's turn to the battle itself, which was fought on the 21st of October 1805 off the Spanish coast at Cape Trafalgar. The battle itself was the culmination of a long campaign. After the Treaty of Amiens in March 1802, Europe was at peace for 14 months. Many ships in the Royal Navy were paid off, and for a while, the British returned to their peacetime activities. But across the Channel, in Europe, Napoleon was planning the next stage of his domination of Europe. He realized that if war broke out again, then the Royal Navy would blockade French and continental ports, as they'd done before, and French overseas trade would be crippled. Napoleon planned to invade England and free the seas for French trade. He ordered the building of a fleet of invasion barges, and the Grand Army was moved to the Pas-de-Calais area. But to get the army across safely, the French fleet would need to control the English Channel. And to this end, he tried to engineer a meeting of his fleets so they could control the sea lanes and protect his invasion barges. He gave orders for the fleets in Toulon and Brest in France and Ferrol in Spain to break out of their blockaded ports. French Admiral Villeneuve, leading the combined French and Spanish fleets, eventually managed to evade Nelson and sail from Toulon for the West Indies on March the 30th, 1805. Nelson soon discovered that Villeneuve had escaped the blockade and resumed the chase across the Atlantic to the West Indies, and then followed the French and Spanish fleets back across to Europe. Villeneuve came back to Cadiz, arriving in late August 1805. Nelson arrived off Cadiz to join Admiral Collingwood's fleet on September the 28th. And here he ordered his frigates under Captain Blackwood to watch the port while he patrolled 50 miles off the coast with the rest of the fleet, hoping to draw the combined fleet out. During the course of the summer, Napoleon, despairing of bringing his fleets together, had abandoned his invasion plans for England and had turned his attention to Austria. The British had sent a small army to Sicily to threaten Napoleon's southern flank and to support the Russians. To try and guard Italy and his operations in Austria, Napoleon ordered Villeneuve to sail back into the Mediterranean. Napoleon had also decided to replace Villeneuve, who he didn't regard highly, with Admiral Rosselli. On September 27th, Villeneuve received his orders to sail back into the Med for Naples to support a landing of 4,000 troops there. He was keen to get away before he was replaced. The British fleet waited for the combined fleet to sail from Cadiz as Nelson refined his plan of attack. Often referred to as the Nelson touch, his intended tactic was that used by other British admirals before him, for example Admiral Howe in the glorious 1st of June battle in 1794, and it followed the concepts put forward by Sir John Clarke in his pamphlets. The plan to charge the enemy line had three principal advantages. First, the British fleet would close with the Franco-Spanish fleet as quickly as possible, reducing the chance that they would be able to escape without fighting. Secondly, it would quickly bring on a melee and frantic battle by breaking the Franco-Spanish line and inducing a series of individual ship-to-ship actions in which the British were likely to prevail. Nelson knew that the superior seamanship, faster gunnery, and better morale of his crews were great advantages. And third, it would bring a decisive concentration on the rear of the Franco-Spanish fleet. The ships in the van, leading, of the enemy fleet would have to turn back to support the rear, which would take a long time. Additionally, once the Franco-Spanish line had been broken, their ships would be relatively defenceless against powerful broadsides from the British, and it would take them a long time to reposition to return fire. The main drawback of attacking head-on was that as the leading British ships approached, the Franco-Spanish fleet would be able to direct raking broadsides fire at their bows, to which they would be unable to reply. And to lessen the time the fleet was exposed to this danger, Nelson had his ships make all available sail, including stunsails, yet another departure from the norm. Nelson was confident that French and Spanish gunners were ill-trained, would probably be supplemented with soldiers, and would have difficulty firing accurately from a moving gun platform. The combined fleet was sailing across a heavy swell, causing the ships to roll heavily and exacerbating these problems. Nelson's plan was indeed a gamble, but a carefully calculated one. Probably the most important thing Nelson did during the period of blockade of Cadiz was to instruct his captains over two dinners aboard Victory on his plan for the approaching battle. The order of sailing, in which the fleet was arranged, when the enemy was first sighted, was to be the order of the ensuing action, so that no time would be wasted in forming a precise line. The attack was to be made in two bodies, one led by his second-in-command, Admiral Cuthbert Collingwood, was to throw itself on the rear of the enemy, while the other, led by Nelson, was to take care of the centre and the vanguard. And in preparation for the battle, Nelson ordered the ships of his fleet to be painted in a distinctive yellow and black pattern, later known as the Nelson checker, that would make them easy to distinguish from their opponents. Nelson was careful to point out that something had to be left to chance. Nothing is sure in a sea battle, so he left his captains free from all hampering rules by telling them that no captain can do very wrong if he places his ship alongside that of the enemy. Nelson reported that his captains were pleased with this innovative plan. Admiral Villeneuve expressed his belief that Nelson would use some sort of unorthodox attack, stating specifically that he believed, accurately, that Nelson would drive right at his line. But his long game of cat and mouse with Nelson had worn him down, and he was suffering from a loss of nerve, arguing that the inexperience of his officers meant he would not be able to maintain formation in more than one group. He chose not to act on his assessment. He thus issued no plan of attack other than setting the mission to reach Toulon. When Villeneuve decided to depart Cadiz, his intention was for French Admiral Mackinnon in the Spanish squadron to sail out with his squadron first and capture or drive off the British frigates. On October 19th, and with a fair wind for leaving Cadiz blowing, Villeneuve hoisted the order for ships to sail. However, there was some confusion amongst the fleet's captains over whether this order was just for Mackinnon's squadron to sail, or the frigates, or the whole fleet. As the fleet eventually set sail, the breeze died away and only 7 battleships and 3 frigates made it out of the harbour. The wind was too light to let them chase off the British frigates, and Villeneuve was forced to order the rest of the fleet to anchor for the night. The British frigate Sirius spotted them and made the signal 370, which meant enemy ships are coming out of port, which was repeated along the chain of frigates until it reached the main fleet. Nelson then signalled the fleet for general chase southeast. His plan was to steer for the Straits of Gibraltar and prevent the combined fleet from sailing into the Mediterranean. On October the 20th, the rest of the combined fleet got under sail and set course for the southeast. Note that because Nelson had reacted quickly to the signal 370, the British fleet had reached the entrance to the strait even before the French and Spanish fleet had left Cadiz. So the British fleet turned and retraced its steps back to the northwest. On October the 21st, the British fleet was sailing as they would fight under signal 72 hoisted on Nelson's flagship. At 5:40 a.m., the British were about 21 miles, 34 kilometres, to the northwest of Cape Trafalgar, with the Franco-Spanish fleet heading southward between their position and the Cape. At 6 a.m., Nelson gave the order to prepare for battle. Shortly after dawn, the French frigate Hermione spotted the British fleet to windward in the west and signalled to Villeneuve. Villeneuve could have sailed on for Gibraltar, but concerned not to fight off a lee shore, he decided to try returning to Cadiz. The combined fleet initially sailed in a line with the Neptuno in the rear and the San Juan de Nepomuceno, commanded by Commodore Chiraca, in the van. Admiral Gravina was out ahead in the Prince de Asturias, and Admiral Villeneuve sailed in the Bucentaure in the centre. Gravina's squadron should have been sailing to windward of the combined fleet to come to the aid of any part of the line threatened by the British, but had in fact taken up station at the van. At 8 o'clock, Villeneuve ordered the fleet to wear together, reverse course, and return to Cadiz. This reversed the order of the line, placing the rear division under Rear Admiral Pierre Dumanoir in the vanguard. The French and Spanish fleet now formed an uneven, angled crescent, with the slower ships generally to leeward and closer to the shore. By 11 a.m., Nelson's entire fleet was visible to Villeneuve, drawn up in 2 parallel columns. The 2 fleets would be within range of each other within an hour. Villeneuve was concerned at this point about forming up a line, as his ships were unevenly spaced and in an irregular formation. The Franco-Spanish fleet was drawn out nearly 5 miles, or 8 kilometres long, as Nelson's fleet approached. As the British drew closer, they could see that the enemy was not sailing in a tight order, but rather in irregular groups. Nelson couldn't immediately make out the French flagship, as the French and Spanish were not flying command pennants. Nelson was outnumbered and outgunned, the enemy totaling nearly 30,000 men and 2,568 guns to his 17,000 men and 2,148 guns. The Franco-Spanish fleet also had 6 more ships of the line, and so could more readily combine their fire. There was no way for some of Nelson's ships to avoid being doubled or even trebled on by enemy ships. Still, the French and Spanish were in a ragged, curved line headed north. As planned, the British fleet was approaching the Franco-Spanish line in two columns. Leading the northern windward column in Victory was Nelson, while Collingwood in the 100-gun Royal Sovereign led the second leeward column. The two British columns approached from the west at nearly a right angle to the Allied line. And here we see Victory leading Temeraire and Neptune, with Euryalus off to the port in the windward column. The variable quality of the combined fleets now began to show. The ships found it difficult in the light wind to find their positions in the line of battle, and the line further sagged away to leeward in the middle. On board the Victory, Nelson ordered Lieutenant Pascoe to make a signal to the fleet. "Mr. Pascoe, I wish to say to the fleet, England confides that every man will do his duty." Expects was easier to hoist rather than spelling out confides. As soon as this was acknowledged, he ordered one final signal. The telegraphic flag and then numbers 1 and 6 engaged the enemy more closely. And these are the famous signals that he issued just before they engaged. At noon, Villeneuve sent the signal engage the enemy, and the French ships Trafalgar fired her first trial shot at Royal Sovereign. As they closed with the enemy, leading British ships were exposed to ferocious broadsides, while being unable to bring their own guns to bear. Royal Sovereign had all sails out, and having recently had her bottom cleaned, outran the rest of the British fleet. She was first in line and took many hits as she came within range of the Trafalgar. Collingwood in Royal Sovereign was the first to break the combined fleet line. As Victory closed on the enemy line, she conducted a turn to the north, towards the van of the combined fleet, now heading northward. Collingwood's column fanned towards the ships of the rear, creating uncertainty about their intention to form a line of battle or not. Nelson changed course once again towards the centre of the line. By the time the vanguard realised what has happened to it, it's too late, and Nelson's feint has worked. Then Victory closed the line, and Captain Hardy took his ship past the rear of Villeneuve's flagship, the Bucentaure. There was no gap between Villeneuve's flagship Bucentaure and the next in line, the Redoutable, so they had to ram through. The enemy shot had already been cutting into the ship for some minutes, and many men were already dead or wounded, including Nelson's secretary, John Scott, and 8 Marines stationed on the poop deck. Seeing this, Nelson ordered the captain of the Marines to disperse his men about the ship, a far-reaching order in that the Marines could have dealt with French sharpshooters and perhaps saved Nelson's life. On the forecastle, the boatswain William Wilmot waited beside the larboard 68-pounder carronade, one of Victory's 2 smashers. It had been loaded with a round shot and a keg of 500 musket balls, and as Victory passed within touching distance of Bucentaure's stern, he fired the carronade into her, raking the French ship from end to end and mowing down the sailors manning their guns. As the Victory continued to sail past, her lower deck guns opened fire as one by one they came to bear. Victory's captain, Thomas Hardy, steered into the smaller Redoutable, and some of the ships in Collingwood's column are now engaged, and their superior gunnery is telling. As Victory cleared the French ship, she came within range of the Neptune, which fired her broadsides into the Victory and damaging the foremast and bowsprit. Hardy ordered the helm over to bring Victory alongside the Redoutable, which was on her starboard side, and as the guns came to bear, she fired her starboard broadside into the French ship. The Victory and the Redoutable crashed together, and their yards were locked. Redoutable shut most of her gun ports to prevent boarding, and the French Marines in the rigging threw grenades and fired down onto the deck of the Victory. Fighting is fierce, with Victory engaged by 3 vessels. Redoutable is manned by well-drilled musketeers, and at about 1:15 p.m., as Nelson and Hardy walked on the quarterdeck, a musket ball fired from Redoutable struck Nelson in the top of the left shoulder and smashed into his spine. He knew straight away that the wound would be fatal, and as he was carried down to the orlop deck, his face was covered with a handkerchief. This was a scene painted numerous times by many great artists, and here we see J.M. Turner's rendition. Fighting continued on the decks above, and as Redoutable was bombarded by Victory's guns, the Temeraire closed on her starboard side and fired into her. The 3 ships locked together, and the Redoutable was slowly pounded into submission. At the head of Collingwood's column, the Royal Sovereign had been engaging the Santa Ana and the Fouquier for some 30 minutes alone, having sailed into the enemy line well ahead of the rest of the division. Collingwood had ordered the lee column to form on the larboard line of bearing, so his ships were not in line like Nelson's, but approaching on a broad front. At this end of the combined fleet's line of battle, the ships were closed up in a loose formation, not in a line. As the other ships of Collingwood's line joined the battle, they were presented with a confused array of ships. The second ship in Collingwood's column, the Belle-Isle, was engaged by l'Aigle, Achille, Neptune, and Fouquier. She was soon completely dismasted, unable to manoeuvre, and largely unable to fight as her sails blinded her batteries. But she kept flying her flag for 45 minutes until the following British ships came to her rescue. The battle continued in the dying wind, and as their masts and sails were shot away, the ships of both fleets drifted slowly about each other, looking for targets through the clouds of smoke. The Mars lost most of her sails and rigging and swung uncontrollably in the swell. Captain Duff, leaning over the side to try and spot the enemy ships, was decapitated by a round shot, and the Mars was raked by several French ships, including the Pluton. Towards the end of the battle, and with the combined fleet being overwhelmed, the still relatively under-engaged portion of the van, under Rear Admiral Pierre Dumanoir, tried to come to the assistance of the collapsing centre. Captain Hardy in Victory ordered the ships to go into the line of battle to counter the threat. So after failing to fight his way through, Dumanoir decided to break off the engagement and led 4 French ships, his flagship the 80-gun Formidable, the 74-gun ships Scipion, Duguay-Trouin, and Mont Blanc, away from the fighting. 3 ships sailed straight for Cadiz, and only the Intrepide and Neptuno sailed to Villeneuve's aid. The Intrepide was engaged by several British ships and was singled out for her bravery in the face of overwhelming odds by several of the British captains. Slowly, the British ships gained the upper hand as one by one the ships of the combined fleet struck their colours or sailed away from the battle. Villeneuve in Bucentaure struck his colours and surrendered, and around 4:15 p.m. Captain Hardy reported to Nelson that the battle was won. "Thank God I've done my duty," were his last words, and he died at 4:30. At 5:30, the French ship Achille blew up, and this signalled the end of the battle. In all, 17 combined fleet ships were surrendered. On hearing of Nelson's death, Admiral Collingwood took command of the fleet. British ships' crews set about repairing their ships, rescuing survivors from the sea, and securing their prizes. Many of these were little better than floating hulks, completely dismasted and leaking badly. To make matters worse, a strong storm struck the days after the battle and lasted a week. In all, 14 of the ships surrendered by the combined fleet sank, with horrendous losses of life. The Victory was towed into Gibraltar, her masts and sails shot to pieces. The casualties were high, as might be expected in such a close-fought action. This slide shows the casualties by ship. The lee column in grey took a greater pounding. The British lost 449 men killed and 1,241 wounded, some of whom subsequently died. The French and Spanish fleets lost 4,408 men killed and 2,545 wounded. Of the combined fleet, the French ships Bucentaure, Algeciras, Swiftsure, Intrepide, Aigle, Berwick, Achille, Redoutable, Fouquet, and the Spanish ships Santissima, Trinidad, Santa Ana, Argonauta, Bahama, San Agustino, San Ildefonso, San Juan de Nepomuceno, and Monaco were taken by the British. Redoutable sank, Achille blew up, San Agostino and Intrepid burned, while the British scuttled Santissimo, Trinidad, and Argonauta. In the gale that followed the battle, Monaco, Fouquet, Aigle, and Berwick were wrecked. So it seems they only benefited from 7 captured ships as prizes. Weeks after the battle, partially repaired Victory was back in England. This painting, entitled The Return of the Hero, shows Nelson's coffin being transferred from HMS Victory to the Commissioner's yacht in the Medway for transport via the Thames to Greenwich. Nelson's funeral occurred on the 9th of January 1806 at St Paul's Cathedral. The event included a grand procession up the River Thames, a lying in state at Greenwich and the Admiralty, and an elaborate service where his coffin was interred in the cathedral crypt. The funeral was one of the most lavish in London's history for a non-royal, attended by thousands and considered a national event. We're fortunate to also have been bequeathed another legacy by J.M.W. Turner, this wonderful painting, The Fighting Temeraire, the ship that came to the rescue of HMS Victory. This shows her being tugged to her last berth to be broken up in 1838. The Battle of Trafalgar was the last great sea action of the period. Though it did not completely destroy the French Navy, who fought other skirmishes later, its ultimate outcome was to secure the supremacy of the British Navy on the high seas for the next 100 years, and it was the end to any threat of invasion from France. It also led Napoleon to his continental strategy and possibly to his disastrous campaign against the Russians in 1812. Even today, the RAN of the 21st century carries traditions, customs, and operational standards, training regimes, etc., that were born of that era. The gloss of the Victory was taken off for the British ships with the news of Nelson's death. It's hard now to appreciate the effect of this news on the ship's crews and on the nation as a whole. A medal was commissioned by Matthew Bolton to commemorate the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, which was distributed to survivors. It was struck in copper for officers and pewter for seamen. But shown here, the now rare Trafalgar clasp to the Naval General Service Medal was produced by the Admiralty and issued to survivors of the battle in 1847. By that time, many would have passed away. It was awarded to those who'd fought in the British ships, though sadly, I understand, not to the women on board, whose presence was unofficial. Although Nelson is still regarded as a national hero in Britain, in 1805 he was the national hero, and to lose him at the moment of his greatest victory was a bitter blow. The nation was in deep mourning. Yet ask a few millennials nowadays who he was and what he achieved and what importance the Battle of Trafalgar had to the security of the Western world at the time, I think there would be many blank faces. Nelson's column still stands proud in Trafalgar Square in London. We even have a town of Trafalgar in Victoria, though the RSL memorial is a little less imposing. While some were subsequently stolen and never reappeared, luckily a few other treasures from the battle still exist. This is Nelson's coat, which he was wearing when shot. It's now at the museum at Greenwich, reunited with the French musket ball in a little case which dealt the deadly blow. His pocket watch, which he was carrying when he died, is in private hands. This amazing sail hangs in the Naval Museum in Portsmouth. At the risk of some controversy, I leave you to ponder who might be the real hero of Trafalgar. Obviously, Nelson and Collingwood, their ship's captains, officers, and sailors, and all who supported the British fleet at Trafalgar deserve enormous accolades. Yet, here's a quote I found during my research, which you might find interesting in considering the part played by Sir John Clarke. Quote, whether Mr. Clarke be really entitled or not to the merit of having suggested the manoeuvre of breaking the line, there can be no doubt that he conceived on land, and without the least experience of sea life, that idea, at a period antecedent to the time when it was put in practice. There is also no pretence in any quarter to deny that his system became a guide to all the operations of the British Navy subsequent to the particular victory in which it first seemed to be acted upon, and thus was the means of enabling British valour to gain a series of conquests which unquestionably proved the salvation of the country. So was it the man who conceived of this manoeuvre, or the man who bravely implemented it at Trafalgar, the most worthy of recognition? Thank you for listening.